Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Get to the Point Tech. Today we're coming back to close the loop on the Ubiquiti Unifi Dream Router 7 and Friends review. The Friends being the U6 Plus, access point, and the Flex Mini switch. So let's jump straight into it. So I'm currently using an Asus router and it has pretty good coverage of the entirety of the house from all 3 floors. And it's currently positioned in the upstairs, so it's able to reach the basement even from its location. But I'm aware that Unifi devices are not designed to be used like this. You're not really supposed to just have one router in the middle of the house and cover everything, although if you're lucky you could get away with it with this one. Traditionally, you would have a separation of concerns. You'd have a router, you'd have your switch, you'd have your Wi-Fi access point, and each device would be doing its own thing. This is one of those rare cases out of Unifi where they do bundle a bunch of the different functionalities that would typically be in separate devices into one little cute box. It's very, very clear that this is meant for home users, whereas a lot of the other Unifi products have a little bit more of a small business to enterprise edge. So for home use, when coming from someone like me who has like one of those overpowered one router to rule them all situations, I was a bit nervous about how easy this would be as a drop-in replacement for my situation. So one of the first tests I'm going to do is do exactly that. I'll take a couple of readings of the Wi-Fi strength and transmission speeds from different parts of the house with my current router, and then I'll replace it with just the Dream Router 7 as it is, and do the same comparison. I'm not expecting it to do much better or better at all, because again, that's not what this thing is meant to be for. Later, I will identify the dead zones and I will add an access point or two depending on how things go. But I want to start with just this one and see how it does as a drop-in replacement, because I think the people who are looking at a device like this are coming from a similar situation from where I'm coming from, having some sort of like TP-Link, Asus, Netgear, whatever router that is just kind of a one and done, instead of going to their mesh systems, which are sometimes extremely expensive or overpowered. I wanted to kind of try something new. Alright, I've got everything set up and running at both my parents' place as well as my own place. Yes, I did buy 2 Dream Router 7s, and I have some thoughts. First of all, the Unifi network management interface is very useful. I've never actually had this much visibility into my network. Taking a step back though, I had 2 scenarios to fix. One was my parents' place, which before was running a Netgear R7000 as a router with 2 TP-Link EAPs. One was a 225 and one was a 245. All that to say, it was running some really legacy hardware, especially the router. I'm embarrassed to even admit that it was running there, but it was serving them well for the speeds that they needed. It's just that it wasn't getting any more firmware updates and there were no more security patches, and so I felt the need to replace it for that reason. It is in their scenario that I installed the Dream Router 7 with the U6 Plus. At my place, I had an Asus RT AC86U. It's a big jambalaya of letters, but basically it was, a last generation or even previous generation router, and I've now replaced it with the Dream Router 7. I'll talk more about the Unifi ecosystem in a minute, but first I want to quickly go over the before and after stats when replacing my old devices with the Unifi ones. Now, while I took measurements from before and after at both locations, the more interesting one is the one at my location. Because I'm using the Dream Router 7 as a drop-in replacement, it gives me the most information in terms of whether or not someone who was in my situation, which has just one main router, would actually benefit from just dropping it in, or would they need additional APs out of the box. So what I'm showing here is a table of some readings I've taken at different locations around the house. The specific location is not relevant to the internet, so I've omitted that. But as you can see, the Asus router generally had stronger signal strength and better transaction rate. But despite that advantage, the speed was not as good as the Dream Router 7. In almost every scenario, the 2.4 gigahertz network was either the same or worse in terms of signal strength, and the 5 gigahertz was almost consistently worse, and same goes for the transaction rate. But in almost every case, the speed was better than the Asus. Now, this is not an apples to apples comparison. The Asus was obviously an older device compared to the brand new Dream Router 7. But what's interesting to me is that even on the old router, I wasn't able to fully saturate my 500 megabit connection, except for when I was standing right next to the router, which is the second last row in this table. Interestingly enough, that is also the only location that the Dream Router 7 has a better transaction rate than before. There is one thing of note that had changed between the readings of the before and after, which is that my internet package changed from 500 megabit down 30 up to 1.5 gigabit down 200 up. But because most of the readings here never really saturated that original 500 megabit connection anyways, I think it's still worth showing the results because the download speeds still show a story where swapping out to the Dream Router 7 still results in a better outcome even with the weaker signal strength. It is worth noting that I kept the settings pretty much the same. My 5 gigahertz network is 80 megahertz wide, and that was the frequency I was connected to when I did the speed tests, as evidenced by the fact that I saturated the 5 gigahertz network at 80 megahertz channel width in the second last test, standing right next to the router at around 860 megabits per second. Overall, I was expecting to see some reduced speeds, but I'm happy to see that things have improved overall. And now I can also benefit from 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, which I will get to in a minute. So back to the Unifi ecosystem. Being able to manage my parents' network from wherever I am is a major quality of life improvement. Seeing what devices are connected, what the signal strength is for each device, what kind of internet traffic each device is using, how much bandwidth each device is using, and then being able to separate the devices into their own VLANs are things that I just either wasn't able to do or was too much of a hassle on the old system. One of the things I used out of the box that was really cool was the zone-based firewall. It's relatively new to the Unifi network application, but it's relatively easy to use. Putting the networks into zones felt unintuitive at first, probably because a home network doesn't have that many networks, and this software is mostly designed for small businesses or enterprise locations that have more complex networks. But once I got familiar with the terminology, it made a lot more sense. I created a couple of different networks. One was my trusted network and one is the IoT network, where I put all of the kind of mostly untrusted devices that may or may not need access to the internet, but certainly don't necessarily need to have access to each other or my trusted devices. So I can set up specific devices to be blocked from the internet without having to create a dedicated network just for those. And my trusted network can speak to the IoT devices, but not the other way around unless they're replying. So for example, when I first set up my network and I put my Philips Hue bulbs onto the IoT network, I wasn't actually able to control them until I enabled this rule that allowed them to respond. And the zone-based firewall made it really easy to understand and visualize what those rules were doing. I still have a lot more work to do, but this is already much better than my old setup where everything was on one network. There was one case that I wasn't really able to get working correctly. It was an Epson scanner that my parents have, and for some reason it just really was not cooperating. Traditionally, you initiate a scan from the scanner and then it goes to the computer, which of course wouldn't work because it's not being spoken to first. But I wasn't even able to get it to work the other way around, so something fishy was happening there. But a Canon printer scanner combo worked perfectly fine. Another cool thing about the Unifi network application are the traffic logs. These logs show all sorts of connection attempts being blocked by the firewall. Some would argue maybe you don't even want to know that those connection attempts are being made, but it was really handy to see. As part of the traffic logs, though, you can also see things like your Apple TV probing for other Apple devices on the network. This was being actively blocked by Unifi, but so far it hasn't broken any of my functionality like AirPlay or FaceTime as long as it was initiated from my phone. Of course, what would be the Dream Router 7 without also trying to play around with the 6 GHz network? I did my tests with the 6 GHz Wi-Fi off to keep the comparison fair, but afterwards I turned it on, and ultimately I was expecting it to be useless for my setup since I'm pretty far from my router. I don't have an optimal setup. But it was a pleasant surprise that even with minus 80 to minus 90 dB signal strength, it still beats the 5 GHz network speeds at those distances. Using the Wi-Fi Man app, I can confirm that my iPhone doesn't even switch to the 5 GHz network even when I'm at minus 90 signal strength, which is fine given the real-world throughput. Future me here. After having run with the 6 GHz network enabled for longer, I can confirm that at the same distances, the difference between the 5 GHz network and the 6 GHz network is outstanding. I don't even live in an area that has a lot of interference, so for me it mostly comes down to the bandwidth differences, but I can confirm that at negative 80 dB on a 6 GHz connection, I can push way more speed than I can at even a more ideal negative 60 dB on the 5 GHz network. And this is all without even saturating the capabilities of the 5 GHz network, which usually caps out at around 850 megabits per second. When you get closer to the Dream Router 7, it's not even a contest because I could fully saturate my 1.5 gigabit connection on the Wi-Fi. There are also things I haven't played around more with yet, things like site-to-site VPN, where you could have two different sites, for example, my site and my parents' site, where you can link them so that they look like they're all on the same network. This could be useful for different kind of scenarios, but for now I've left it disabled. There's also the teleport VPN, which is potentially useful for when you're traveling and you want to easily connect your phone back home to use your home internet, especially if you're on some like untrusted Wi-Fi. But I currently prefer to use Tailscale for that situation, and I think behind the scenes they both end up using WireGuard, so I don't really think there's a strong advantage if for one or the other, as long as you are using it on the devices that are compatible. I think Tailscale has a bit more compatibility than the Teleport VPN. There are also some things I'm still figuring out, like encrypted DNS. I've set up the Dream Router so it has encrypted DNS set to auto, which defaults to using Google and Cloudflare DNS. However, it doesn't really result in success in tests reliably. I'm actually not even sure if the DNS over to HTTPS is working correctly. The tests don't show it reliably on, and it does seem to load balance between Google and Cloudflare in a way that I don't really love. So I still have to play around a bit more with this setting. And of course, there are some things that are just downright annoying. The automatic Wi-Fi channel selection doesn't seem to do anything at all. It's supposed to pick the best channel at startup for each frequency, but it never seems to change once it was set up for the first time. I have a neighbor whose Wi-Fi channels change daily, and my Unifi never reacts even when they are on the same channel. As a test one day when my router was on the exact same channels as my neighbor, I hard rebooted the router and it just happily landed on the same channels again, not really making any attempt to change or be on a better channel. So for now, I've changed it from auto to manually selected channels for each frequency, and I'll just continue to monitor it. In terms of the hardware, the Flex Mini switch is a cheap, useful managed switch. It's good for VLANs, and the power over Ethernet makes it really easy, but I'm glad it comes with a power brick anyways. One thing to note is that even though I plugged it into the power brick, I also had it plugged into the power over Ethernet port on the Dream Router 7, and it was actually preferring the power over Ethernet over the USB-C power brick. And I looked it up online, and there's nothing official about this, but it does seem like if there's power over Ethernet, it will prefer that, and then if that fails for any reason, it will use the USB-C brick as a backup. Just an interesting design choice on their part. The U6 Plus has been working very well for my parents. It has pretty good range. There's no fan inside, unlike Ubiquiti's 6 GHz gear, which is why I got it. I bought a PoE injector, as you saw earlier, and it's been working well for that, and it's cheap and it works really well. The Dream Router 7 itself, it's really nicely made. It kind of has this like Portal 2 vibe to it, or maybe even a WALL-E if you're into, Pixar movies. However, it does run at a pretty steady 52 degrees Celsius, and the fan is always running. It's not too loud, but the sound is definitely noticeable in a quiet room, and it sounds like a very, very small mini fridge. Having said that, it's not the end of the world. It is audible, and I initially was wondering whether or not I had a defective unit, but I have gotten used to it, and it's not that bad. So it's just informational. But if you're going to put this in a utility closet or a basement or, somewhere not in a bedroom, it's probably not going to be noticeable at all. There is a setting to change the fan mode from standard to quiet. I haven't played too much with it yet. I'm going to give it some time to test. But given that with the fan constantly running, it's already at 52 degrees, I'm hesitant to turn it off because I think in quiet mode, it may either turn off the fan or run it at a lower RPM. Hey, it's me from the future. I can confirm that in quiet mode, the fan turns off completely. Unfortunately, that means that the temperatures rose way more than I was comfortable with, eventually reaching higher than 80 degrees Celsius, almost double the temperature with the fan on. Right now it's winter where I live, and so the average room temperature of my place is lower than it would be in the summer, so I don't think this is a viable or safe option. I would have much rather preferred a better quality fan like the ones found in a MacBook Pro, which would make this a non-issue. So this is a disappointing shortcut that Ubiquiti has taken here. Overall, it's been very useful to see what's on my network. It's got beautiful hardware, aside from the cheap fan sound in the router. I really wish that they would put a little bit more money into the fan there. I feel much better about the security hygiene of my network, even if I still have things I can improve on. And ultimately, I can recommend a Unifi for anyone who is tech savvy enough to want to know what's going on in their network. At this point, I'm not sure if I can go back. RIP to my future wallet. I've seen what becomes of people when they go too far into the Unifi rabbit hole. And that's that. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video and found it useful, please give it a like below. And don't forget to hit subscribe so that you don't miss any of my future videos. For now, I will say thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.